What would you do if the person you buried in your heart, the one you mourned for 20 years, suddenly stood in front of you, alive? In 1999, Daniel Whitford's life collapsed in a single weekend. He left home for a 2-day business trip, kissed his 29-year-old wife Lydia goodbye, and expected to return to the same warm smile. Instead, he walked into silence. The garden hose still coiled where she'd last been seen watering flowers. Her car was in the driveway. The house was locked from the inside. Lydia had vanished. Police scoured the countryside. Helicopters, dogs, neighbors combing the fields. The only clue came weeks later, scraps of clothing stained with blood beside a riverbank. Investigators told Daniel what no husband ever wants to hear: she was most likely gone forever. By spring, the court declared Lydia legally deceased. Daniel grieved while whispers followed him everywhere. Was he a heartbroken widower, or a man hiding a terrible secret? For years, he carried that shadow. He remarried, moved away, and tried to build a new life. But the whispers never left him. Fast forward 2 decades. A quiet Saturday morning in Birmingham. Daniel is older now, gray at the temples, shopping for fruit. He turns toward a stall, and freezes. Across the aisle, a woman stands with a young boy. She has the same auburn hair, the same scar above her eyebrow, the same eyes that once promised forever. Lydia. She looks straight at him. Recognition flickers. Panic floods her face. She pulls the boy close and disappears into the crowd. Daniel's heart pounds. For 20 years, he buried her. For 20 years, he carried suspicion like a curse. Now, here she is, alive, with a child who looks nothing like him. Was it a ghost? A cruel trick of memory? Or had his wife chosen to vanish, leaving him to carry the weight of her absence? Before we uncover the shocking truth, let me ask you, have you ever trusted someone so deeply that the thought of their betrayal felt impossible? What would you do if that trust shattered not after weeks or months, but decades? In the late 1990s, the town of Ashton Vale, just outside Manchester, was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving doors unlocked and knew every neighbor by name. Daniel Whitford, then in his early 30s, had lived there all his life. He wasn't flashy, nor did he draw much attention. Steady, reliable, and perhaps a little reserved, he worked as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company. He wore suits that were always neat but never expensive. People in town would describe him as dependable, a man who kept his lawn trimmed and his bills paid on time. His wife, Lydia, was almost his opposite in energy. At 29, she carried a quiet warmth that made children gravitate toward her. She volunteered at the church's after-school program, where she read stories, helped with homework, and organized crafts. Parents admired her patience, kids adored her gentle spirit. To neighbors, they seemed like a balanced pair, Daniel with his calm, business-like demeanor, Lydia with her soft smile and willingness to serve others. Yet behind the closed doors of their modest 2-story home, the cracks in their marriage were more visible. Friends close to Lydia recalled how she sometimes hesitated before answering questions about Daniel. She wasn't bruised or outwardly mistreated, but there was a tension in her eyes when his name came up. She once confided to a fellow church volunteer that Daniel was a man of rules, that his love felt more like obligation than affection. Divorce, however, was not something she felt she could pursue easily. Her family came from a strict background where ending a marriage was seen as failure. Lydia, ever conscious of appearances, kept her worries buried. Daniel, for his part, believed he was doing what was expected of him, working long hours to provide, paying off the mortgage, and ensuring stability. But what he lacked was emotional presence. He rarely expressed affection in public and struggled to connect deeply, even in private. Lydia longed for tenderness, for passion, for something that felt alive. Instead, she felt like she was fading into the role of dutiful wife with little else. The year 1999 brought new pressures. Daniel had recently been promoted, a position that demanded frequent travel. He was often away for 2 or 3 days at a time, sometimes longer. Lydia, meanwhile, had more time on her hands, filling her days with volunteering and quiet routines at home. This growing separation only widened the emotional gulf between them. When Daniel returned from trips, conversations were brief, often focused on bills, schedules, or practicalities. Their once hopeful young marriage now felt more like two people coexisting in parallel lines that rarely touched. It was around this period that Lydia met Richard Hale. He wasn't from Ashton Vale. Richard drifted in and out of town, picking up construction jobs when he could. He was rough around the edges, with a criminal record that included petty theft and fraud. Yet, to Lydia, he represented something Daniel never did: attention. Richard had an intensity that made her feel seen. He asked questions, lingered in conversation, and treated her as if she were more than just a wife waiting at home. Friends would later recall seeing Lydia talking with him near the church parking lot or at the corner shop. At first, they thought little of it. But looking back, those small encounters seemed to carry weight. It was subtle, but it was the beginning of something that would change everything. As the summer of 1999 wore on, Lydia grew restless. She spoke less about the future with Daniel and more about vague dreams of escape. She never openly admitted unhappiness to her family, but in small comments, "Sometimes I wonder what else life could be," her dissatisfaction slipped through. Meanwhile, Daniel was too consumed by work and his own sense of duty to notice. He assumed that providing materially was enough, that silence meant contentment. The final weeks before Lydia's disappearance seemed unremarkable on the surface. She tended her garden, taught Sunday school, and prepared dinners in the quiet kitchen of their home. Yet beneath that surface lay a storm only she knew was brewing. She was planning something that no one, not even those closest to her, would have suspected. Neighbors would later remember odd details. One woman recalled that Lydia seemed distracted, staring off while trimming roses, as if her mind was elsewhere. Another said she once asked about what happens if someone disappears without a trace, though it was brushed off as idle curiosity. Small signs that, in hindsight, revealed a woman already envisioning a life beyond the one she had. On the morning Daniel left for his business trip in late August, Lydia kissed him goodbye with unusual softness. He took it as a rare moment of tenderness. She, however, knew it might be the last time they stood together in that kitchen. Within 48 hours, she would vanish from Ashton Vale, leaving behind not just a husband and family, but an entire town that believed tragedy had struck. Her disappearance wasn't the sudden storm people imagined. It was the result of months of quiet unrest, secret conversations, and unspoken dissatisfaction. To the outside world, Lydia was the perfect wife and volunteer. Inside, she was a woman suffocating under expectations, desperate for escape, and willing to risk everything to seize it. What no one knew then was that her decision would not only fracture her own life, but also cast a permanent shadow over Daniel's. A shadow that would stretch for 2 decades, until fate brought them face to face in the unlikeliest of places. On the evening of August 28, 1999, Daniel returned from his business trip. The house on Birchwood Lane was eerily still. The curtains in the living room were drawn, Lydia's shoes rested neatly by the door, and her car was parked exactly where he had left it. But she wasn't there. At first, Daniel thought little of it. Perhaps she had gone to a neighbor's, or maybe she was at the church finishing some work. But when night fell and her side of the bed remained untouched, dread began to take hold. He called her family, no one had seen her. He called the church, she hadn't shown up all day. By midnight, he rang the police. Officers arrived within the hour. They found no signs of forced entry. The doors were locked, windows intact. A half-folded basket of laundry sat on the sofa, suggesting she had been in the middle of chores when she vanished. Her purse was still inside, though a small overnight bag was missing. To police, this raised questions: had she left willingly, or was she taken? The next morning, search teams fanned out across Ashton Vale. Volunteers scoured hedgerows and footpaths, while helicopters hovered above the nearby moors. For days, the community threw itself into the search. Posters with Lydia's smiling face appeared on lampposts and shop windows. Local newspapers ran headlines, "Wife missing in Ashton Vale." But no matter how far they searched, no one found her. Weeks later, a hiker wandering near the River Blythe stumbled upon a bundle of clothing snagged on reeds. Torn fabric, soaked from rain and mud. When police collected the items, forensic testing revealed traces of Lydia's blood. Though no body was found, investigators announced the likelihood of foul play. This shifted the entire tone of the investigation. What had been a missing person case now carried the weight of presumed death. Naturally, suspicion fell first on Daniel. Detectives noted his oddly measured demeanor. Unlike the weeping husbands often seen on televised appeals, Daniel remained controlled. He answered questions without stumbling, but some saw this as coldness rather than composure. Lydia's younger brother voiced his doubts openly, telling reporters he believed Daniel knew more than he was letting on. Neighbors fed the gossip mill. One recalled how rarely the couple seemed affectionate in public. Another mentioned that Daniel had been away during her disappearance, which to some seemed too convenient. The narrative began forming: was he the husband who arranged his wife's end? Daniel sat through hours of questioning at the Ashton Vale police station. Detectives pressed him about the state of his marriage. Did Lydia ever talk about leaving? Did they argue before he left for his trip? Did he know anyone who might wish her harm? He insisted he had no idea where she could be. Yes, their marriage had its quiet patches, but there was no violence, no threats. He swore he had been in Liverpool with colleagues at the time of her disappearance, and his alibi checked out. Hotel logs confirmed his stay, and co-workers vouched for his presence at dinner. Still, suspicion lingered. Police searched his car, his office, even the attic of his home. Nothing tied him to a crime. Without a body, they were trapped in a fog of speculation. As investigators broadened their net, they gathered statements from those who last saw Lydia. A neighbor swore she had spotted her around 4 p.m. watering the garden, wearing a light summer dress. A shopkeeper said Lydia had stopped by the day before to buy bread and seemed distracted, staring off into the distance. More intriguing was a man who claimed he saw Lydia walking along the edge of town that evening, though he admitted it was getting dark and he couldn't be entirely sure. With no concrete evidence, these leads faded into the background. The story quickly spread beyond Ashton Vale. Television crews arrived, eager to capture footage of candlelight vigils held in Lydia's honor. Reporters lingered outside Daniel's home, thrusting microphones toward him whenever he stepped outside. Headlines asked, "Did husband know more?" The community divided. Some defended Daniel, describing him as a hard-working man unfairly maligned. Others whispered that his calmness was unnatural, that guilt hid beneath his neatly pressed shirts. The uncertainty fueled gossip, and gossip fed the press. Investigators leaned heavily on forensic analysis of the riverbank clothing. The blood confirmed injury but not cause of death. Torn fabric suggested struggle, but it could not prove whether Lydia was killed or if the scene had been staged. They tested soil samples from Daniel's car, compared fibers from the clothing to items in the Whitford home, and even drained parts of the river in search of a body. Each attempt led nowhere. Without remains, the prosecution had no foundation to pursue charges. By early 2000, with months of fruitless searching behind them, the case ground to a halt. The court faced the painful decision: should Lydia be declared legally dead? Her family, broken by grief, supported it, wanting closure. Daniel, though reluctant, signed the paperwork. The declaration came that spring. In the eyes of the law, Lydia Whitford ceased to exist. Yet the unanswered questions hung like storm clouds over Daniel's life. Though officially cleared, Daniel couldn't shake the suspicion that followed him everywhere. At pubs, whispers trailed behind him. At work, colleagues avoided sensitive subjects. The absence of proof was not proof of innocence in the court of public opinion. For Lydia's family, anger festered. They blamed Daniel not because evidence pointed to him, but because grief needed someone to hold accountable. Every family gathering became a place where her name was spoken with pain and suspicion. The case file was eventually boxed, labeled, and placed among hundreds of other cold cases. The world moved on. But for Daniel, life had shifted permanently. He was the man whose wife had vanished, the man suspected but never charged, the man who lived under an invisible sentence. What no one realized was that this crime had no corpse, no weapon, no traceable killer, only a silence that stretched for decades. It was a silence broken only when a chance trip to a market 20 years later pulled the entire mystery back into daylight. When the truth surfaced in 2019, it sent shockwaves through both the Whitford family and the wider public. Daniel had spotted her twice at the Birmingham market. The second time, convinced he wasn't hallucinating, he hired a private investigator. Within days, the truth was undeniable. The woman living quietly as Helen Brooks in a modest flat was Lydia Whitford, the same woman the courts had declared dead 20 years earlier. Detectives approached cautiously. To the outside world, Lydia was a middle-aged mother raising a boy named Ethan. She kept her head down, worked cash-in-hand cleaning jobs, and had no official record tying her to Helen Brooks. But once police secured DNA evidence from a discarded coffee cup, the case could no longer be ignored. Officers arrived at her flat one evening, knocking firmly on the door. Ethan, startled, answered first. Behind him, Lydia appeared, her face paling as she realized the past she had buried was standing on her doorstep in the form of uniformed officers. She denied her identity at first, insisting she was Helen and had never heard of Ashton Vale. But the DNA results left no room for denial. She was placed under arrest for fraud and obstruction of justice. The image of Lydia, once the community's beloved volunteer, being led away in handcuffs sent tabloids into a frenzy. Prosecutors faced an unusual legal puzzle. Technically, Lydia had not murdered anyone. Her crime was deception, staging her own death, disappearing, and allowing her husband and family to live under a false reality. The charges brought against her included identity fraud, for creating and maintaining a false identity as Helen Brooks. Obstruction of justice, for planting false evidence near the river to mislead investigators. Insurance fraud implications, though Daniel claimed he never touched the payout, the mere fact that the policy had been paid created complications. Each charge carried weight, but the biggest battle wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in the court of public opinion. The prosecution painted Lydia as selfish and manipulative. They argued that she knowingly allowed Daniel to suffer under suspicion for years while she built a new life. She had wasted police resources, deceived her community, and violated the trust of those who cared for her. They highlighted her partnership with Richard Hale, a man with a criminal past, as evidence that her actions weren't simply the desperate choice of a trapped woman but part of a calculated plan. The bloodied clothing found near the river was presented as a deliberate hoax that had cost the public thousands in investigative hours. The prosecutor's closing line in pre-trial hearings struck hard: this was not a woman escaping abuse. This was a woman escaping accountability. The defense countered with a very different story. They portrayed Lydia as a woman suffocated by a cold, controlling marriage, too ashamed to seek divorce in a family and community where it was frowned upon. They argued that her disappearance was not born of malice but of desperation, an act of survival rather than manipulation. Her lawyer emphasized Richard Hale's role, claiming he was the instigator who convinced her to disappear and helped stage the false evidence. Richard's death years earlier meant he couldn't testify, but it also meant Lydia carried the burden alone. They also pointed to Ethan. If Lydia were imprisoned, her son, innocent in all of this, would suffer most. That single fact swayed many observers. From the moment of her arrest, headlines screamed sensational phrases: "the wife who returned from the dead" and "ghost woman found in Birmingham market." Talk shows debated her motives. Some viewers sympathized, framing her as a woman who took drastic measures to reclaim control of her life. Others saw only cruelty, she had abandoned her family, left Daniel under suspicion, and built her new identity on lies. Daniel himself became a reluctant public figure again. Cameras followed him as he entered court, reporters hounding him with questions. Did he still love her? Would he testify against her? Was he relieved or furious? His statements were measured, but his bitterness showed. I buried her once. I never thought I'd have to do it again, he told one journalist. The trial preparations uncovered new layers. Some speculated that Daniel had secretly known she was alive all along, benefiting from the life insurance money while pretending to be a grieving widower. Others whispered that Lydia's claims of emotional control were exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated, to gain sympathy in court. Daniel, in turn, was forced to provide financial records proving he had never touched the insurance payout. Bank statements showed the money sat untouched in a trust account, lending credibility to his insistence that he had not profited from her death. Another twist emerged when Lydia's brother, long convinced Daniel was guilty of murder, faced public embarrassment. For years, he had spoken against Daniel, only to discover his sister was alive and had deceived them all. His anger shifted from suspicion of Daniel to betrayal by Lydia. Court proceedings dragged on for months. Prosecutors pressed for a prison sentence, arguing that a crime of this magnitude demanded accountability. The defense pleaded for leniency, citing Lydia's role as Ethan's sole caregiver and her lack of violent criminal history. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Lydia broke down in tears more than once, insisting she had feared returning because she believed Daniel's family would never allow her freedom. Daniel, by contrast, sat stone-faced, a man forced to relive 2 decades of grief under public scrutiny. Public opinion swayed with every development. One day, Lydia was the villain. The next, she was the tragic figure of a woman who dared to escape an unhappy life. Ultimately, the judge sought balance. Lydia was found guilty of fraud and obstruction but spared prison. Instead, she received probation and community service, with strict orders to repay investigative costs and cooperate with the insurance company. The decision was controversial, some saw it as mercy, others as a failure of justice. For Daniel, the verdict brought little closure. He had lost 20 years to grief, suspicion, and whispers. Now, he was left with a living reminder of betrayal, walking freely in the same city. For Lydia, freedom came with a price, her secret life destroyed, her reputation permanently stained, and her son forced into the glare of unwanted attention. The legal battle ended, but the story was far from over. Because beyond verdicts and sentences, what lingered was a haunting question: can truth, once buried for decades, ever truly set anyone free? The courtroom in Leeds Crown Court was packed from the first day. Journalists lined the gallery, sketch artists hunched over their pads, and curious members of the public queued outside long before proceedings began. For many, this was not just a trial, it was theater. A woman who had returned from the dead after 2 decades was about to explain herself before the law. The prosecution opened with a steady parade of witnesses. The first was the hiker who had found Lydia's clothing on the banks of the River Blythe. He described the day in detail, the torn fabric tangled in reeds, the dread that gripped him as he realized what he'd stumbled upon. The prosecutor used this moment to underscore the deliberate cruelty of Lydia's staged death. She allowed her loved ones to believe she was gone, while she built a new life under a false name. Next came Lydia's younger brother. His voice trembled as he spoke of years spent accusing Daniel of murder, years of holidays overshadowed by grief, and the shame of learning his sister had been alive all along. I hated Daniel for 20 years, he admitted, staring across the courtroom. Turns out, my sister was the liar. Do you know what that does to a family? His testimony cut through the room like glass. Then Daniel himself was called. Calm but visibly weary, he described how he filed the missing person report, how he lived under suspicion, how every sideways glance in a pub reminded him that people thought he was a killer. She didn't just leave me, he said, voice low. She buried me with her. The defense countered with witnesses of their own. A church volunteer testified that Lydia had confided about feeling trapped in a loveless marriage, describing Daniel as emotionally absent and controlling. Another witness, a neighbor from her years living as Helen Brooks, spoke of Lydia as a dedicated mother, someone who worked tirelessly to provide for her son and never caused trouble. One of the most dramatic moments came when prosecutors displayed the recovered clothing from 1999. Time had faded the fabric, but the bloodstains remained visible. Forensic experts confirmed the blood matched Lydia's DNA, proving she had staged her death with intent to deceive. The prosecution argued that this was no impulsive act, it was calculated, premeditated, and meant to mislead law enforcement. The defense attempted to soften this blow, claiming the staging was orchestrated by Richard Hale, the drifter who had since died in a car crash. Lydia's lawyer painted her as a vulnerable woman manipulated by a stronger personality. She wasn't the mastermind, the defense insisted. She was desperate, and desperation makes people follow dangerous paths. The tension reached its peak when Lydia herself took the stand. For the first few minutes, she spoke softly, describing her unhappiness, the shame of divorce in her family, and how Richard offered her a way out. But under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed hard. "Mrs. Whitford, or should I say, Mrs. Brooks, do you deny planting evidence to mislead police?" Her voice cracked. "I was scared. I thought it was the only way to be free." "Free?" the prosecutor shot back. "You call it freedom when your husband was accused of murder? When your family spent 20 years grieving a woman who was alive the entire time?" The courtroom fell silent as Lydia broke down in tears. Her lawyer tried to recover, framing her as a victim of circumstance, but the damage was done. To many in the gallery, her tears looked less like remorse and more like guilt laid bare. The prosecution hammered one point relentlessly: Lydia had choices. She could have filed for divorce. She could have sought help. Instead, she created a false death, allowing her family to endure anguish while she built a hidden life. Their closing argument was sharp: this was not survival. This was betrayal dressed up as desperation. The defense fought back by highlighting Lydia's humanity. They reminded the court of her volunteer work, her dedication to Ethan, and her clean record outside of this case. They argued that jailing her would punish not just Lydia but also an innocent boy who relied solely on his mother. Their final plea was emotional: do not let vengeance blind us to compassion. Justice should not create another orphan. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The air was so thick with anticipation that even the rustle of papers seemed loud. The foreman stood, eyes fixed forward. "On the charge of identity fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. On the matter of insurance fraud, we find the defendant guilty of complicity, though not direct financial benefit." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lydia closed her eyes, gripping the rail in front of her. Daniel sat motionless, his jaw clenched, the faintest nod betraying a grim sense of vindication. The judge weighed his words carefully. He acknowledged the seriousness of the crimes but also considered Lydia's role as Ethan's sole caregiver. Sentencing was measured: probation, mandatory repayment of investigative costs, and 500 hours of community service. No prison term. Reactions were immediate and divided. Outside the courthouse, protesters shouted for harsher punishment, holding signs that read, "Justice for Daniel," and "Lies have consequences." Others defended the ruling, insisting that jailing Lydia would have punished Ethan most of all. Daniel left through a side entrance, avoiding cameras, but later released a brief statement. "The law has spoken. But nothing can return the 20 years I lost. I only hope she reflects on the cost of her choices." Lydia's brother refused to look at her as she left the courtroom. "You didn't just disappear," he muttered to reporters. "You destroyed us." For Lydia, the sentence meant freedom with strings attached. She walked out of court not in chains, but into a world where her name was forever linked with betrayal. The cameras followed her, Ethan's hand in hers, as she slipped into a waiting car. For the public, the case left no consensus. Was she a desperate woman reclaiming her life, or a manipulator who let others suffer while she hid in plain sight? Whatever the opinion, one fact was undeniable: the story of Lydia Whitford, the wife who returned from the dead, would live on long after the courtroom emptied. Thank you for staying with us through this extraordinary story. The case of Daniel and Lydia isn't just about a woman who vanished, it's about trust, betrayal, and the heavy cost of secrets carried for decades. Stories like these remind us that truth has a way of breaking through, no matter how long it's been buried. If this story gripped you, don't forget to show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with friends who love true crime stories, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next case we uncover here on Dark Psychology True Crime Story. We also want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Lydia deserved leniency, or should the punishment have been harsher? How do you think Daniel should move forward after such betrayal? Drop your opinions below, we read every single one. And one more thing, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see this community connecting from all corners of the world. Until next time, stay alert, stay curious, and remember, the truth always finds its way back.